January 17, 1945. Philippine Islands, Luzon. The bamboo door swung open with a crack that split the humid morning air. Lieutenant Colonel Masao Watanabe stepped into the captured American supply depot, his boots crunching on shattered glass and scattered sea ration tins. Sunlight poured through shell holes in the corrugated roof, illuminating towers of canned goods stacked higher than a man could reach. Peaches, ham, condensed milk, chocolate bars wrapped in wax paper, each one stamped with an eagle and 13 stripes. Watanabe had not eaten meat in 4 months. His stomach, shrunken and acidic, cramped at the sight. He lifted one can, turned it over in his palm and began to laugh, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the tin walls. "They feed their soldiers like emperors," he muttered to the captain beside him, a gaunt man whose uniform hung from his frame like a shroud. "And still they cannot fight." It was a joke that would return to haunt him 6 months later, when he would stand behind barbed wire in a camp near Manila, weighing 40 pounds more than the day he surrendered, staring at his own reflection in a mess hall window, and wondering if he had been defeated not by bullets but by beef. This is the story of a war fought not only with steel and fire, but with calories and ideology. A war where the simple act of eating became a weapon more devastating than any bomb, where the abundance of a nation transformed enemies into converts, and where Japanese officers, men trained to endure starvation, to find honor in suffering, encountered something their entire philosophy had not prepared them for: the relentless, indifferent generosity of American plenty. In the winter of 1941, as the Imperial Japanese Navy carved its way across the Pacific, the soldiers of the rising sun carried with them a doctrine forged in scarcity. Japan was a nation of volcanic islands, a place where rice paddies clung to mountainsides, and every grain was sacred. The military rationed its men 600 grams of rice per day, supplemented with pickled radish, dried fish, and occasionally a thumb-sized portion of fatty pork. Officers ate only slightly better. This was not cruelty, it was necessity. Japan's empire sprawled across 10,000 miles of ocean, and every calorie had to be shipped, guarded, fought for. Hunger was strategy. Hunger was virtue. The Imperial Army's training manual, the Senjin-kun, codified this philosophy into doctrine. "Do not live in shame as a prisoner," it commanded. "Die to avoid the ignominy of capture." Surrender was apostasy. A Japanese soldier who laid down his rifle did not simply betray his emperor, he ceased to exist in the eyes of his family, his nation, his gods. Death was preferable. Starvation was noble. And so when these men looked at their enemy across the Pacific, they saw softness. Americans, they believed, were a people grown fat on excess, a civilization that would crumble the moment its supply lines were cut, the moment its soldiers had to choose between honor and a full stomach. The fall of Bataan in April 1942 seemed to confirm this belief. 76,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to Japanese forces, the largest capitulation in U.S. military history. Japanese soldiers watched in astonishment as columns of prisoners staggered out of the jungle, gaunt and hollow-eyed, many too weak to walk. But even in their desperation, these men had expected something the Japanese could not fathom. They had expected to be fed. They had expected mercy, medical care, clean water. They had expected their captors to honor the Geneva Conventions, a document the Empire of Japan had never ratified, a set of rules that seemed to Japanese officers like the whining of children who had never truly suffered. The death march that followed was not merely cruelty, it was pedagogy. The Japanese guards who beat, bayoneted, and starved the prisoners on that 65-mile trek to Camp O'Donnell were teaching a lesson. This is what war is. This is what defeat means. You expected comfort. You expected fairness. You expected someone to take care of you. But the universe does not care, and neither do we. 7,000 men died on that march. Thousands more perished in the camps that followed, subsisting on watery rice gruel and the occasional rotted vegetable. Japanese officers observed this suffering with something approaching confusion. Why did these prisoners not simply die with dignity? Why did they cling to life with such desperation, trading wedding rings for handfuls of grain, eating rats and insects, weeping over photographs of wives and children they would never see again? It seemed weak. It seemed pitiable. It confirmed everything the Imperial Army believed about the decadence of the West. But war is a mirror that reflects truths neither side wishes to see. By the summer of 1944, the tide of the Pacific had turned. The island-hopping campaign ground forward, each captured atoll bringing American forces closer to the Japanese homeland. And in the wake of each battle came something unprecedented: Japanese prisoners of war. Not many. The Senjin-kun still held most men in its iron grip, but enough to fill the camps being constructed on Guam, Saipan, Okinawa, enough to force American commanders to confront a question they had never seriously considered. What do you do with an enemy who was trained to die rather than surrender? The first groups arrived emaciated, delirious, many suffering from wounds they had attempted to treat with mud and prayer. They expected execution. Some begged for it. The concept of honorable captivity did not exist in their mental universe. To be captured was to be erased. Several attempted suicide in the first days, swallowing stones or trying to hang themselves with bootlaces. American guards, most of them farm boys from Iowa and Tennessee, watched these attempts with bewilderment. They had been prepared for fanaticism, for screaming banzai charges and kamikaze planes. They had not been prepared for this quiet, systematic self-destruction, this inability to accept survival. But the US military had protocols, procedures outlined in manuals that assumed even enemies were human beings entitled to basic dignities. The prisoners were registered, deloused, given medical examinations. Infected wounds were cleaned and dressed. Malaria was treated with quinine. Dysentery was treated with sulfur drugs. And then, most shockingly of all, they were fed. The mess halls in these camps operated on the same principles as those serving American troops. The US War Department had calculated that an active soldier required 4,000 calories per day to maintain combat effectiveness. Prisoners of war, though not active, were still entitled to 3,000, a figure determined not by generosity but by the cold logic of the Geneva Conventions and the American bureaucratic instinct to follow rules, even when the enemy had written no such rules for captured Americans. 3,000 calories. In practical terms, this meant 3 meals a day. Breakfast, oatmeal or pancakes, powdered eggs, canned fruit, bread, butter, coffee with sugar and condensed milk. Lunch, soup, sandwiches, more fruit. Dinner, meat, pork chops, beef stew, fried chicken, spam, accompanied by potatoes, green beans, carrots, bread and dessert, cake, pie, pudding, ice cream when the supply ships arrived. The first time Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe, captured in February 1945 after his unit was overrun near Manila, walked into the mess hall at the Guam detention facility, he thought he was being mocked. Long tables stretched the length of a warehouse, each one laid with metal trays and tin cups. American soldiers stood behind serving lines, scooping food onto plates with the mechanical efficiency of factory workers. Watanabe joined the line because he had no choice, because guards gestured him forward, because his body moved before his mind could process what was happening. A ladle of beef stew splashed onto his tray, 2 slices of white bread, a mound of mashed potatoes, green beans glistening with butter, a square of yellow cake, an apple, a cup of coffee. He carried the tray to a table and sat. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, their faces blank with shock. Some wept. One man vomited after 3 bites, his stomach unable to process the sudden richness. Watanabe lifted a spoonful of stew to his lips. The beef was tender, fatty, salted. The gravy was thick and dark. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and felt the warmth spread through his chest. Then he ate another bite, and another. He finished the tray in 10 minutes, scraping the metal clean with his bread, and when a guard asked if he wanted more, he nodded, unable to speak. That night, lying on a cot with a full stomach for the first time in a year, Watanabe stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he had experienced with everything he had been taught. He had been told Americans were weak. He had been told their civilization was rotten, that their soldiers fought only for money and comfort, that they would collapse the moment the war came home. But if that were true, why were they feeding him? Why were they wasting resources, precious meat, precious fuel to transport it, precious labor to cook it on men who had tried to kill them? It was not mercy. He understood that much. Americans did not weep over captured Japanese the way Japanese generals wept over dead subordinates. There was no poetry in this, no ritual, no acknowledgement of shared suffering. It was something stranger and more unsettling. It was procedure. It was bureaucracy. It was the mechanical application of rules that treated even enemies as units to be processed, catalogued, fed and housed according to standardized guidelines. It was the efficiency of a nation so wealthy, so glutted with resources, that it could afford to feed its enemies better than most nations fed their own soldiers, and that, more than any battlefield defeat, shook him. The pounds came slowly at first, 10, 20. By the 3rd month, Watanabe had gained 40 pounds. His uniform, which had hung loose on his frame, now pulled tight across his belly. He could feel the weight in his face, his neck, his thighs. Other prisoners experienced the same transformation. Men who had arrived as walking skeletons now looked almost healthy, their cheeks filled out, their eyes clear. The camp doctor, a cheerful captain from Ohio, who spoke no Japanese but communicated through interpreters and hand gestures, examined them weekly, recording weights and blood pressure with the same detached professionalism he might apply to livestock. "You're doing great," the doctor said through the interpreter, slapping Watanabe on the shoulder. "Another month, and you'll be ready to play baseball." Watanabe did not understand the joke. He understood only that his body was changing in ways he could not control, and that this change felt like betrayal. He had been taught that the body was a tool, something to be disciplined, starved if necessary, sacrificed without hesitation. But now his body responded to abundance with shameless eagerness. It stored fat. It craved sugar. It woke him at night with hunger, even after 3 full meals. It had become American. The other prisoners felt it too. In the evenings they gathered in the barracks and spoke in low voices about what was happening to them. Some tried to fast, to refuse the food as a gesture of defiance, but hunger always won. Others ate with guilty fervor, shoveling down steaks and potatoes while apologizing to the ghosts of comrades who had starved to death in the jungles of Guadalcanal and Burma. A few embraced it fully, joking that if they were going to be prisoners they might as well be fat prisoners, that at least their families would see photographs and know they had survived, even if survival meant dishonor. But beneath the jokes was a deeper unease. The food was not just sustenance, it was propaganda. Every meal carried an implicit message. This is what we can afford to give even our enemies. Imagine what we give our own people. Imagine what we can bring to bear against you. The abundance was not kindness. It was a demonstration of power, a kind of violence inflicted not with fists but with generosity, a way of saying, you cannot win, you never could, we have so much that we can waste it on you. Some prisoners began to crack, not from brutality but from comfort. They volunteered for work details not because they were forced but because idleness felt unbearable. They learned English phrases from the guards. They asked questions about America, about cities, farms, factories, cars, movies. They listened to the radio broadcasts that played in the mess hall, hearing reports of Japanese cities burning under waves of B-29 bombers, hearing the casualty counts, hearing the slow, grinding inevitability of defeat. And they ate. They ate, and they grew heavy, and they began to wonder if everything they had believed was a lie. Watanabe stopped laughing. He stopped joking about American weakness. In the mirror, he saw a stranger, a fat man in a clean uniform, a man who had survived when so many others had died, a man who had eaten steak while his country starved. He wondered if he was still a soldier. He wondered if he had become something else. The war ended in August 1945 with 2 flashes of light that turned cities into ash. When the news reached the camps, some prisoners wept, others sat in silence. A few tried again to kill themselves, slashing wrists with mess hall forks, leaping from guard towers. But most simply waited. They waited for orders that never came, for rescue that never arrived, for a homeland that no longer wanted them. Repatriation began in the fall. Ships carried them back to Japan, back to a nation of rubble and orphans, back to families who had held funerals years ago, and now stared at these returnees as if they were ghosts or imposters. Many prisoners, including Watanabe, arrived weighing more than they had when the war began. Their relatives touched their faces, their bellies, and asked the question that had no good answer. How did you survive when our sons starved? There was no parade for the returnees, no honor. The government issued them train tickets and discharge papers and told them to disappear. Some found work. Others drifted into poverty. A few wrote memoirs, though most of these were never published. The stories too uncomfortable, too contradictory to the narratives Japan was building about victimhood and resilience. Watanabe lived another 40 years, working as a schoolteacher in a small town near Osaka. He never spoke publicly about the camps, but in private, to his children, he sometimes told a story about the war, not about battles or bravery, but about a meal, about beef stew and white bread, about the moment he realized that hunger was not a virtue, that suffering was not wisdom, that the ideology he had been willing to die for had been built on a foundation of deliberate scarcity, while his enemies swam in an ocean of abundance so vast they could drown their prisoners in it and never notice the loss. We were taught that Americans were soft, he said once, near the end of his life, and perhaps they were. But softness, we learned, is not the same as weakness. A soft people can afford to be soft. We could not, and that was the difference. The steak in the end was never just steak. It was an argument. It was proof. It was the physical manifestation of a truth the imperial army could not accept, that some nations do not need to starve their soldiers to make them strong, that abundance does not necessarily breed weakness, that a civilization built on surplus and waste and excess can still produce men willing to die for it, not because they have no choice, but because they believe rightly or wrongly that the system that fed them is worth preserving. The prisoners who gained weight in those camps carried that knowledge home. It did not make them love America. It did not erase the bitterness of defeat, but it planted a seed of doubt. Doubt about the teachings that had shaped their lives, doubt about the leaders who had sent them to die, doubt about whether honor and hunger were truly the same thing. And in the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, as it adopted American-style capitalism and American-style abundance, as it became a nation where children grew taller and fatter than their parents, the question lingered: had Japan lost the war on the battlefield, or had it lost the moment its soldiers saw, for the first time, what a wealthy nation could afford to give even its enemies? The answer, perhaps, is that it lost both. But the second defeat, the defeat inflicted with kindness, with bureaucracy, with 3,000 calories a day, was the one that could not be reversed. You can rebuild a city, You can rewrite a history, but you cannot uneat a steak. You cannot forget the feeling of a full stomach. You cannot return to the monastery once you have tasted the feast. And so the Japanese officers who once laughed at American POW camps, who saw their luxury as proof of decadence, went home carrying a secret they could not share, that they had been changed not by cruelty but by generosity, not by violence but by beef, not by the sword but by the ladle. They had been conquered by abundance, and that conquest, quiet and shameful and irreversible, was the most complete victory of all.